Welcome back. Series of unfortunate events. Bad beginning. In our first two chapters, we met the Baudelaire children. The banker came and told them that their parents had sadly passed away in a house fire and all their belongings burnt. He lived with the banker for a while, didn't care for it. Got sent to Count Olaf, hated it more. Bright spot, Justice Strauss next door has a great library and she's really, really nice. Count Olaf makes them do all kinds of chores, doesn't tell them what he wants for dinner, tells them to make dinner, doesn't like what they make, including picking the baby up and holding her up high, which you should never do with a baby, and smacking Klaus across the face. Kids go to Mr. Poe, the banker, tell them how horrible it is. He reminds them that he's the acting father, the acting parent. So however he decides to raise them is what happens. They don't really like that. Little do they know, Mr. Poe contacts Count Olaf and tells him what the kids were talking to him about. So he's trying to be nicer to them and having them act in one of his plays. Klaus and Sonny, the baby and the middle-aged one, are going to be midgets in the crowd. Our friend Violet is going to play the bride in a play called A Marvelous Marriage by Al Funcoot. And then Justice Strauss also has a guest starring role in it. When we left off, the kids are trying to figure out what his plan is because they know it's just something to do with getting his money. And so they go and get books from Justice Strauss's house. So that's where we left off. Chapter 7. There are many, many types of books in the world, which makes good sense because there are many, many types of people, and everybody wants to read something different. For instance, people who hate stories in which terrible things happen to small children should put this book down immediately. But one type of book that practically no one likes to read is a book about the law. Books about the law are notorious for being very long, very dull, and very difficult to read. There is one reason many lawyers make heaps of money. The money is an incentive. The word incentive here means an offered reward to persuade you to do something you don't want to do, to read along dull and difficult books. The Baudelaire children had a slightly different incentive for reading these books, of course. Their incentive was not heaps of money, but preventing Count Olaf from doing something horrible to them in order to get heaps of money. But even with this incentive, getting through the law books at Justice Strauss Private Library was a very, very, very hard task. Goodness, Justice Strauss said when she came into the library and saw what they were reading. She had let them in the house, but immediately went into the backyard to do her gardening, leaving the Baudelaire orphans alone in her glorious library. I thought you were interested in mechanical engineering, animals of North America, and teeth. Are you sure you want to read those enormous law books? Even I don't like reading them, and I work in law. Yes, Violet lied. I find them very interesting, Justice Strauss. So do I, Klaus said. Violet and I are considering a career in law, so we are fascinated by these books. Well, Justice Strauss said, Sonny can't possibly be interested. Maybe she'd like to come help me with gardening. Whippy, Sonny shrieked, which meant I'd much prefer gardening to sitting around watching my siblings struggle through law books. Well, make sure she doesn't eat any dirt, Klaus said, bringing Sonny over to the judge. Of course, said Judge Strauss. We want her to be sick for the big performance. Violet and Klaus exchanged a look. Are you excited about the play? Violet asked hesitantly. Justice Strauss' face lit up. Oh, yes, she said. I've always wanted to perform on stage ever since I was a little girl. And now, Count Olaf has given me the opportunity to live my lifelong dream. Are you thrilled to be part of the theater? I guess so, Violet said. Of course you are, Judge Strauss said, stars in her eyes and sunny in her hand. She left the library, and Klaus and Violet looked at each other and sighed. She's stage-struck, Klaus said. She wouldn't believe that Count Olaf is up to something no matter what. She wouldn't help us anyways, Violet pointed out glumly. She's a judge, and she'd just start babbling about in loco parentis like Mr. Poe. That's why we've got to find a legal reason to stop the performance, Klaus said firmly. Have you found anything in your book yet? Nothing helpful, Violet said, glancing down at a piece of scrap paper in which she had been taking notes. 50 years ago, there was a woman who left an enormous sum of money to her pet weasel, and none to her 3 sons. The 3 sons tried to prove that the woman was insane, so the money would go to them. What happened? Klaus asked. I think the weasel died, Violet replied, but I'm not sure. I have to look up some of the words. I don't think it's going to help us anyways, Klaus said. Maybe Count Olaf is trying to prove that we're insane so he'd get the money, Violet said. But why would making us be in the marvelous marriage prove we were insane? Klaus asked. I don't know, Violet admitted. I'm stuck. Have you found anything? Around the time of your weasel, lady, Klaus said, flipping through the enormous book he had been reading. A group of actors put on a production of Shakespeare's Macbeth, and none of them wore clothing. Violet blushed. You mean they were all naked on stage? Only briefly, Klaus said, smiling. The police came and shut down the production. I don't think they were very helpful either. It was just interesting to read about. Violet sighed. Maybe Count Olaf isn't up to anything, she said. I'm not interested in performing in this play, but perhaps we're all worked up for about nothing. Maybe Count Olaf really is just trying to welcome us into a family. How can you say that? Klaus cried. He struck me across the face. But there's no way he could get a hold of our fortune just by putting us in a play, Violet said. My eyes are tired from reading these books, Klaus, and they aren't helping us. I'm going to go out and help Justice Strauss in the garden. Klaus watched his sister leave the library and felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. The day of the performance was not far off, and he hadn't figured out Count Olaf was up to, let alone how to stop him. All his life, Klaus had believed that if you read enough books, you could solve any problem. But now he wasn't so sure. You there, a voice coming from the doorway startled Klaus out of his thoughts. Count Olaf sent me to look for you. You are to return to the house immediately. Klaus turned and saw one of the members of Count Olaf's theater troupe, the one with hooks for hands, standing in the doorway. What are you doing in this musty old room anyways? He asked in a croak of a voice, walking over to where Klaus was sitting, narrowing his beady eyes as if to read the title of the books. Inheritance Law and Its Implications, he said sharply. Why are you reading that? Why do you think I'm reading it? Klaus said. I'll tell you what I think. The man put one of his terrible hooks on Klaus's shoulder. I think you should never be allowed inside this library again, at least until Friday. We don't want a little boy getting big ideas. Now where's your sister and that hideous baby? In the garden, Klaus said, shrugging the hook off of his shoulder. Why don't you go get them? The man leaned over until his face was just about inches from Klaus's, so close that the man's features flickered in a blur. Listen to me very carefully, little boy, he said, breathing out foul steam with every word. The only reason Count Olaf hasn't torn you limb from limb is that he hasn't gotten hold of your money. He allows you to live while he works out his plans. But ask yourself this, you little bookworm. What reason will he have to keep you alive after he has your money? What do you think will happen to you then? Klaus felt an icy chill go through him as the horrible man spoke. He had never been so terrified in all his life. He found that his arms and legs were shaking uncontrollably, as if it were having some sort of fit. His mouth was making strange sounds, like Sonny's always did, as he struggled to find something to say. Klaus heard himself choke out. When the time comes, the hook-handed man said smoothly, ignoring Klaus's noises, I believe Count Olaf just might leave you to me. So if I were you, I'd start acting a little nicer. The man stood up again and put both his hooks in front of Klaus's face, letting the light from the reading lamp reflect off the wicked-looking devices. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to fetch your poor orphan siblings. Klaus felt his body go limp, and the hook-handed man left the room. And he wanted to sit there for a moment and catch his breath, but his mind wouldn't let him. This was his last moment in the library, and perhaps his last opportunity to foil Count Olaf's plan. But what to do? Hearing the faint sounds of the hook-handed man talking to Justice Strauss in the garden, Klaus looked frantically around the library for something that could be helpful. Then, just as he heard the man's footstep heading back his way, Klaus spied one book and quickly grabbed it, and he tucked it in his shirt and put his book inside. Hastily retuckering it just as the hook-handed man re-entered the library, escorting Violet and carrying Sonny, who was trying without success to bite the man's hooks. I'm ready to go, Klaus said quickly and walked out the door before the man could get a good look at him. He walked quickly ahead of his siblings, hoping that nobody would notice the book-shaped lump in his shirt. Maybe, just maybe, the book Klaus was smuggling could save their lives. All right. So they went to they're at Justice Strauss's house, and they were looking through the books. Were they really anything helpful in those books? Not really. They're boring books, so even though they really wanted to read them, they was having a hard time. But then there just wasn't anything that was going to help them that they found. Count Olaf sent his hook-handed friend over to catch them. He kind of said some stuff that kind of makes you wonder what's going on here. He talked about Count Olaf getting the money, and he said he should be looking at inheritance books until Friday. Little thoughts there. What do you think that might mean? Yep, we will have to read and see if that has anything to do with what's going on with the play. At the last minute, Klaus found some book. We don't know what book it was. He thinks might be helpful, and how did he get it out of the library? Yep, he tucked it down in his pants and covered it with his shirt, so then hopefully nobody will see it. And that's where we left off. All right. On to chapter 8. Klaus stayed up all night reading, which was normally something he loved to do back when his parents were alive. Klaus used to take a flashlight to bed with him and hide under the covers, reading until he couldn't keep his eyes open. Some mornings, his father would come into Klaus's room to wake him up and find him asleep, still clutching his flashlight in one hand and his book in the other. But on this particular night, of course, the circumstances were much different. Klaus stood by the window squinting as he read his smuggled book, eyed the moonlight that trickled into the room. He occasionally glanced at his sisters. Violet was sleeping fitfully, a word which here means with much tossing and turning on the lumpy bed. Sunny had wormed her way into the pile of curtains so that she just looked like a small heap of clothes. Klaus had not told his siblings about the book because he didn't want to give them false hope. He wasn't sure the book would help them out of their dilemma. The book was long and difficult to read, and Klaus became more and more tired as the night wore on. Occasionally his eyes would close. He found himself reading the same sentence over and over. He found himself reading the same sentence over and over. He found himself reading the same sentence over and over. But then he could remember the way the hook hands of Count Olaf's associate had glinted in the library, and would imagine them tearing into his flesh. And he would wake right up and continue reading. He found a small scrap of paper and tore it into strips, which he used to mark the significant parts of the book. By the time the lights outside grew gray with the approaching dawn, Klaus had found out all he needed to know. His hope rose along with the sun. Finally, when the first few birds began to sing, Klaus tiptoed to the door of the bedroom, eased it open quietly, carefully not to wake the restless Violet or Sunny, who was still hidden in the pile of curtains. Then he went to the kitchen and sat and waited for Count Olaf. He didn't have to wait long before he heard Olaf tromping down the tower stairs. When Count Olaf walked into the kitchen, he saw Klaus sitting at the table and smirked, a word which here means smiled in an unfriendly, phony way. "Hello, orphan," he said. "You're up early." Klaus's heart was beating fast, but he felt calm on the outside, as if he had on a layer of invisible armor. "I've been up all night," he said, "reading this book." He put the book out on the table so Olaf could see it. "It's called Nuptial Law," Klaus said, "and I learned many interesting things while reading it." Count Olaf had taken out a bottle of wine to pour himself some breakfast, but when he saw the book, he stopped and sat down. "The word nuptial," Klaus said, "means relating to marriage." "I know what the word means," Count Olaf growled. Where did you get that book?" "From Justice Strauss's library," Klaus said, "but that's not important. What is important is that I have found out your plan." "Is that so?" Count Olaf said, with his own eyebrow raising. "And what is my plan, you little runt?" Klaus ignored the insult and opened the book to where one of the scraps of paper was marking his place. "The law of marriage in this community are very simple," he read out loud. "The requirements are as follows: the presence of a judge, a statement of I do by both bride and groom, and the signing of an explanatory document in the bride's own hand." Klaus put the book and pointed at Olaf. "If my sister says I do and signs a piece of paper while Justice Strauss is in the room, then she is legally married. This play you're putting on shouldn't be called The Marvelous Marriage. It should be called The Menacing Marriage. You're not going to marry Violet figuratively. You're going to marry her literally. This play won't be pretend. It will be real and legally binding. Count Olaf laughed a rough, hoarse laugh. Your sister isn't old enough to get married. She can get married if she has the permission of her legal guardian, acting in loco parentis, Klaus said. I read that too. You can't fool me. Why in the world would I want to actually marry your sister? Count Olaf asked. It is true she's very pretty, but a man like myself can acquire any number of beautiful women. Klaus turned to a different section of nuptial law. A legal husband, he read out loud, has the right to control any money in the possession of his legal wife. Klaus gazed at Count Olaf in triumph. You're going to marry my sister to gain control of the Baudelaire fortune, or at least that's what you planned to do. But when I show this information to Mr. Poe, your play will not be performed, and you will go to jail. Count Olaf's eyes grew very shiny, but he continued to smirk at Klaus. This was surprising. Klaus had guessed that once he announced what he knew, this dreadful man would have been very angry, even violent. After all, he had a furious outbreak just because he wanted roast beef instead of puttanesca sauce. Surely he had been even more enraged to have his plan discovered, but Count Olaf just sat there as calmly as if they were discussing the weather. I guess you found me out, Olaf said, simply. I suppose you're right. I'll go to prison, and you and your orphans will go free. Now, why don't you run up to your room and wake your sisters? I'm sure they'll want to know all about your grand victory over my evil ways. Klaus looked closely at Count Olaf, who was continuing to smile, as if he had just told a clever joke. Why wasn't he threatening Klaus in anger, or tearing his hair out in frustration, or running to pack his clothes and escape? This wasn't happening at all the way Klaus had pictured it. Well, I will go tell my sisters, he said, and walked back to his bedroom. Violet was still dozing on the bed, and Sunny was still hidden beneath the curtains. Klaus woke Violet up first. I stayed up all night reading, Klaus said breathlessly as his sister opened her eyes, and I discovered what Count Olaf is up to. His plan is to marry you for real, and when you and Justice Strauss and everyone all think it's just a play, and once he's your husband, he'll have control of our parents' money, and he can dispose of us. How can he marry me for real? Violet asked. It's only a play. The only legal requirements of marriage in this community, Klaus explained, holding up nuptial laws to show his sister where he'd learned the information, are you saying I do and signing a document in your own hand in the presence of a judge like Justice Strauss? Surely I'm not old enough to get married, Violet said. I'm only 14. Girls under the age of 18, Klaus said, flipping to another part, can marry if they have permission of their legal guardian. That's Count Olaf. Oh no, Violet cried. What can we do? We can show this to Mr. Poe, Klaus said, pointing to the book, and he will finally believe us that Count Olaf is up to no good. Quick, get dressed while I wake up Sunny, and we can be at the bank by the time it opens. Violet, who usually moved slowly in the morning, nodded and immediately got out of the bed and went to the cardboard box to find some proper clothing. Klaus walked over to the lump of curtains to wake up his younger sister. Sunny, he called out kindly, putting his hand where he thought his sister was. Sunny. There was no answer. Klaus called out Sunny again, pulled away the top of the folded curtains to wake up the youngest Baudelaire child. Sunny, he said, and then he stopped. For underneath the curtain was nothing but another curtain. He moved aside all the layers, but his little sister was nowhere to be found. Sunny, he yelled, looking around the room. Violet dropped the dress she was holding and began to help him search. They looked in every corner, under the bed, and even inside the cardboard box. But Sunny was gone. Where can she be? Violet asked worriedly. She's not the type to run off. Where can she be indeed? Said a voice behind them, and the two children turned around, and Count Olaf was standing in the doorway, watching Violet and Klaus as they searched the room. His eyes were shining brighter than he had ever had, and he was still smiling like he had just uttered a joke. All right, that's the end of that chapter. So, kind of a weird kind of thing, wasn't it? Klaus figured out Count Olaf's plan. And what was that plan? Yep, he's going to marry Violet for real. And based on the law, it could happen. Just need the justice, her to say I do, sign a piece of paper. When that happens, he takes control of the money, and he'd be welcome to get rid of all the kids and not worry about it. So after confronting Count Olaf, He goes upstairs to wake his sister up to tell her, and they decide to go tell Mr. Poe. So he woke up Violet, and then he's going to go wake up Sunny. But what happens when he goes to wake up Sunny? Yes, she is gone. And as they're frantically looking for her, they hear a voice behind them, and that is Count Olaf. So, our bad beginning is continuing. All right, chapter 9. Yes, Count Olaf continued, it certainly is strange to find a child missing, and one so small and helpless. Where's Sunny? Violet cried. What have you done with her? Count Olaf continued to speak as if he had not heard Violet. But then again, one sees strange things every day. In fact, if you two orphans follow me out to the backyard, I think we will see something rather unusual. The Baudelaire children didn't say anything, but followed Count Olaf through the house and out the back door. Violet looked around the small, scraggly yard in which she had not been since she and Klaus had been forced to chop wood. The pile of logs they had made was still lying there untouched, as if Count Olaf had merely made them chop logs for his own amusement, rather than for any other purpose. Violet shivered, still in her nightgown, but as she gazed here and there, she saw nothing unusual. You're not looking in the right place, Count Olaf said. For children who read so much, you two are remarkably unintelligent. Violet looked over in the direction of Count Olaf, but could not meet his eyes. The eyes on his face, that is. She was staring at his feet and could see the tattooed eye that had been watching the Baudelaire orphans since their troubles had begun. Then her eyes traveled up Count Olaf's lean, shabbily dressed body, and she saw that he was pointing up with one scrawny hand. She followed his gesture, found herself looking at the forbidden tower. It was made of dirty stone, which was only one lone window, and just barely visible in that window was what looked like a bird cage. Oh no, Klaus said in a small, scared voice, and Violet looked again. It was a bird cage, dangling from the tower window like a flag in the wind, but inside the bird cage she could see a small and frightened Sunny. When Violet looked closely, she could see there was a large piece of tape across her mouth and ropes around her body. She was utterly trapped. Let her go, Violet said to Count Olaf. She has done nothing to you. She is an infant. Well now, Count Olaf said, sitting on a stump, if you really want me to let her go, I will. But surely even a stupid brat like you might realize that if I let her go, or more accurately, if I ask my comrade to let her go, poor little Sunny might not survive the fall down to the ground. And that 30-foot tower, which is a very long way for a very little person to fall, even when she's inside a cage. But if you insist... No, Klaus cried, don't. Violet looked up into Count Olaf's eyes, and then the small parcel that was her sister hanging from the top of the tower, moving slowly in the breeze. She pictured Sunny toppling from the tower and on to the ground, and pictured her sister's last thoughts being ones of sheer terror. Please, she said to Count Olaf, feeling fear in her eyes. She's just a baby. Will you do anything? Anything. Just don't harm her. Anything? Count Olaf asked, his eyebrows raising. He leaned in towards Violet and gazed into her eyes. Anything? Would you, for instance, considering marrying me during tomorrow night's performance? Violet stared at him. She had an odd feeling in her stomach, as if she were the one being thrown from the great height. The really frightening thing about Olaf, she realized, was that he was very smart after all. He wasn't merely an unsavory drunken brute. He was an unsavory, clever drunken brute. While you were busy reading books and making accusations, Count Olaf said, I had one of my quietest, sneakiest assistants skulk into your bedroom and steal little Sunny away. She is perfectly safe for now, but I consider her to be a stick behind a stubborn mule. Our sister is not a stick, Klaus said. A stubborn mule, Count Olaf explained, does not move in the direction if owners want him to. In that way, it's like you children who insist on mucking up my plans. Any animal owner will tell you that a stubborn mule will move in the proper direction if there's a carrot in front of it and stick behind it. It will move towards the carrot because it wants the reward of food, and away from the stick because it does not want the punishment of pain. Likewise, you will do what I say to avoid the punishment of the loss of your sister, and because you want the reward of surviving this experience. Now, Violet, let me ask you again. Will you marry me? Violet swallowed and looked down at Count Olaf's tattoo. She could not bring herself to answer. Come on, Count Olaf said, his voice faking a word here which means feigning kindness. He reached out a hand and stroked Violet's hair. Would it be so terrible to be my bride, to live in my house for the rest of your life? You're such a lovely girl. After the marriage, I wouldn't dispose of you like your brother and sister. Violet imagined sleeping beside Count Olaf and waking up each morning to look at this terrible man. She pictured wandering around the house, trying to avoid him all day, and cooking for him his terrible friends at night. Perhaps every night, for the rest of her life. But then she looked up at her helpless sister and knew what her answer must be. If you let Sonny go, she said finally, I will marry you. I'll let Sonny go, Count Olaf answered, after tomorrow night's performance. In the meantime, she will remain in the tower for safekeeping, and as a warning, I will tell you that my assistants will stand guard at the door to the tower staircase in case you're getting any ideas. You're a terrible man, Klaus spat out. But Count Olaf merely smiled again. I may be a terrible man, Count Olaf said, but I have been able to concoct a foolproof way of getting your fortune, which is more than you've been able to do. With that, he began to stride towards the house. And remember that, orphans, he said. You may have read more books than I have, but it didn't help you gain the upper hand in this situation. Now give me that book which gave you such grand ideas, and do the chores I assigned you. Klaus sighed and relinquished a word which here means gave to Count Olaf even though he didn't want to. The book on nuptial law. He began to follow Count Olaf into the house, but Violet stayed still as a statue. She hadn't been listening to the last speech of Count Olaf's, knowing it would be full of his usual self-congratulatory nonsense and despicable insults. She was staring at the tower, not at the top where her sister was dangling, but the whole length of it. Klaus looked back at her and saw something he hadn't seen in quite some time. To those who had been around Violet long, nothing would have seemed unusual, but those who know her well knew that when she tied her hair up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes, it meant that the gears and levers of her inventing brain were whirling at top speed. All right, so Count Olaf took Sonny. Where did he put her? Yep, top of the tower. She's dangling in a bird cage at the top of the tower. Why did he do this? Because he knew if he threatened to hurt the baby, the other two kids would do everything he wanted. Did Violet say yes to marrying him? Yep, she did, because she didn't want anything to happen to her sister. But at the end of the chapter, she had her hair tied up. What does that mean when Violet ties her hair back? That means her head's thinking, she's getting ideas. So that's how we ended. Then that's where we'll pick up in our next video. We are really close to finding out how this first book of the series ends. So until next time.